Lesson 2.3, Glucose Homeostasis in the Blood, the Metabolism Game. The goals of this lesson are to show how the liver, muscles, and fat work together to maintain energy homeostasis, and to use real-life examples of diet and physical activity when discussing energy homeostasis. At the end of this lesson, students should be able to explain where energy is stored after a meal, explain how energy comes out of storage during exercise or times of fasting, and apply metabolism to real-life scenarios. We'll achieve these goals by playing a board game to learn about the processes that maintain blood glucose homeostasis. To prepare for this lesson, you will need to review the key scientific concepts that will be presented throughout the lesson. They include the names, input, and output of the metabolic processes, the role of the small intestine, liver, pancreas, fat, muscle, kidneys, and brain in blood glucose homeostasis, and which metabolic processes are turned on and off during fasting, feasting, and exercise. You can review this scientific content in the background reading provided for you in the teacher primer, the teacher manual, and the student workbook. The teacher primer provides in-depth knowledge about the scientific content presented in this lesson. The teacher manual or lesson plan provides a minute-by-minute explanation of the lesson structure, including instructions on how to manage the discussion and the activity. The student workbook provides additional explanations for the students. Students will be playing a board game in opposing teams of students. For each team, you will need to print one board game, one copy of the set of game instructions, and for each pair of opposing teams, you will need to print and cut out one set of cards, including food, activity, and trivia cards. Tip: if you plan on reusing the game boards and cards with several classes, it may be beneficial to laminate these items. You will also need to print out one homework worksheet per student. To play the game, the students will need items to represent glucose, amino acids, and lipids. Poker chips or coins can be used, or pieces of colored paper cut into small squares. Each group will need 31 glucose tiles, 5 amino acid tiles, and 10 lipid tiles. The key points of this lesson's do now are that ATP can't travel in the blood from cell to cell, but glucose can, and that every cell uses glucose to create ATP for energy. We get there by engaging students in a discussion about glucose homeostasis. Use the do now to let students brainstorm the answer to why is homeostasis of glucose in the blood important? Some possible answers to these questions are given on slide 3. You can review this concept using the teacher primer and the teacher manual. The key point of this lesson's discussion is that blood glucose levels are maintained by several organs. Some increase blood glucose and some decrease blood glucose. We'll get there by using the energy homeostasis model. Before going on to the activity today, it is important for students to have a general understanding of how glucose homeostasis is maintained. Use slide 5 to review the function of organs in the energy homeostasis model. Each organ is presented and the role of the organ is discussed. The slide is animated so you can walk through the functions of each organ. The key points of this lesson's activity are that the liver, adipose tissue, and muscles have unique roles in maintaining blood glucose homeostasis, and the body can store or create new glucose, lipids, and amino acids depending on what is needed at that time. We'll get there by having students play a board game. The board game is played by opposing teams of students. Depending on your class size, you may want to simply divide your class into 2 teams or make multiple sets of opposing teams around the classroom. Caution: the rules of this game may seem a bit unclear at first, but most classrooms get the hang of it after only 1 or 2 rounds of gameplay. Each team will be given a metabolism game board, which represents the primary organs of glucose homeostasis: the liver, the adipose tissue, the muscle, and the blood. Each team will start with a baseline quantity of glucose, amino acids, and lipids, which can be represented in the game using poker chips, 3 colors of paper cut into small pieces, 3 types of coins, or anything else you have on hand. The goal of the game is to end the game with the same number of glucose, amino acids, and lipids that you started with, meaning that you want to maintain this homeostasis throughout the game. The game can end after a certain number of rounds or after a certain amount of time, whichever works best for your classroom. To set up the game, divide your students into an even number of teams. Teams will play one-on-one. Give each team of students a game board, 31 glucose tiles, 5 amino acids tiles, and 10 lipid tiles. Each set of opposing teams should have 3 decks of cards, a deck of food cards, a deck of activity cards, and a deck of trivia cards. These deck of cards should be shuffled and placed face down in a stack on the table. The food cards tell students how many of the 3 macronutrients are included in that food. The activity cards tell students the cost and macronutrients of doing that activity. And the trivia cards are used to test students' knowledge throughout the game, and if answered correctly, offer students a get-out-of-jail-free type benefit. The game is played in 3 rounds. Each round has 7 steps. One player at the table draws an activity card from the top of the deck. Both teams will participate in the same activity. To do so, each team removes the appropriate number of glucose, amino acid, and lipid tiles from their game board. Each team answers the trivia card read by the opposing team. If answered correctly, that team holds on to the trivia card and can use it later to decide not to eat a food card drawn in the future. Each team decides how many food cards they will draw to rebalance their energy stores. Each team randomly draws their food cards from the top of the deck and collects the appropriate number of glucose, amino acid, and lipid tiles. Each team places their new glucose, amino acid, and lipid tiles on the game board. And then each team rebalances homeostasis using their newly eaten glucose, amino acid, and lipid tiles. There is a minimum number of glucose that must be in the blood. This may mean that glucose is pulled from the liver or that amino acids have to be cashed in to create new glucose. Just as in our bodies, there are limits as to what and how much can be stored in the organs. These limits are written on the game board. Another link between this game and real biology is what we call energy transformations, or how some of the macronutrients can be exchanged for one another. For example, extra glucose and amino acids are converted to and stored as fat. New glucose can be synthesized from amino acids. New amino acids can be synthesized from glucose. And the body can use lipids for energy in place of glucose as a last resort when no more glucose or amino acids are left. The specific rules around this are listed in the game instructions document, as well as in the teacher manual. An important point here is that we use actual scientific terminology to describe these processes, such as gluconeogenesis, lipogenesis, and transamination. The reason for including this terminology is so that the link between the game and the next lesson's lecture is made for them. Try to use this terminology as much as possible when explaining the game rules. They will also use these concepts in tonight's homework. As always, you can review all of the information presented here in the teacher manual and review the concepts in the teacher primer. The key points of this lesson wrap-up are: when there's too much glucose in the blood, insulin from the pancreas tells the liver to convert that glucose to glycogen and fatty acids. When there is too little glucose in the blood, glucagon released from the pancreas tells the liver to export glucose into the blood. We'll get there by using the same model of energy homeostasis that students were introduced to in Lesson 2.1. Use the images on slides 7 and 8 to review the function of these organs in maintaining blood glucose homeostasis. Then ask students to describe how those functions are changed when there is too much or too little glucose in the blood. The key points of this lesson's homework are to learn the names of the metabolic processes and to summarize and recap how the metabolic processes work together. We'll get there by asking students to complete a worksheet. In the homework worksheet, students will match the names of the metabolic process with a description. Students will also label an image that summarizes how the metabolic processes work together. There are a lot of concepts and terminology presented in this lesson. Your students don't need to grasp everything at this point. We will revisit the same concepts again in Lesson 2.4 and again throughout the remainder of Unit 2. Some teachers elect to use this game after Lesson 2.4 instead of before. In Lesson 2.4, we review the same concepts but present it as a lecture and discussion. If you think your students will struggle with the concepts in the board game, you may want to complete Lesson 2.4 first. At the end of the lesson, students should be able to explain where energy is stored after a meal, explain how energy comes out of storage during exercise or times of fasting, and apply metabolism to real-life scenarios. You will want to remind students that the 3 macronutrients are used for energy in cells via the TCA cycle and the electron transport chain. On the next lesson, we will see in more detail how the metabolic pathways are linked to ATP production. Remember, all cells, except red blood cells which don't have mitochondria, make most of their ATP via the TCA cycle and the electron transport chain. Don't forget, if you have any questions, concerns, or feedback, to let us know. You can contact any of the CTSE team members and we'll be happy to help.